Hi, we're so excited to talk to you today, to Mary Howard for your upcoming course, Maximize the Power of Guided Reading. And this is a subject you have plenty to say on, but let's start off. And can you tell me what your professional background is and how you got started doing guided reading?
Well, my background really led me to guided reading because I started teaching in 1972, so going on 49 years. And at that time, I began as special ed and then was trained as a reading recovery teacher, also as title teacher, reading coach, and reading specialist. So I really moved into guided reading because of my deep interest in children who are our most fragile readers. Many people don't realize that guided reading is not new. Mari Clay began the concept in 1960 and then continued it within her reading recovery. I was trained as a reading recovery in 1990, but reading recovery is one-on-one, so a much more intensive form. In 1996, Fountas and Pinnell wrote the book Guided Reading, Good First Teaching, which is really the seminal book of guided reading. And so that initiated my continued understandings of guided reading. And I began really focusing heavily on what we do in those small groups for children who need some rapid growth in reading so that we can close that gap.
Okay. So for your course, what are some guided reading perspectives that would be helpful for teachers to know?
Well, definitely, I think that one of the most important things happened when Fountas and Pinnell, who are the gurus of guided reading, they wrote edition 2 of guided reading, and it was no longer called Guided Reading, Good First Teaching. It was called Guided Reading, Responsive Teaching Across the Grades. They describe responsive teaching as what we do moment by moment, the decisions that teachers make. And I can't think of a better description for guided reading, that when we're doing guided reading, we're analyzing readers in action. And so one of the problems that I've seen with guided reading in many, many years of doing it with children is that it's gradually morphed into something that we have kind of one size fit all our way across the board, so that we're using scripted programs, so that we're using very, very controlled lesson plans. And I think that two things have led to that. One is that many schools are mandating guided reading, but what they're not doing is providing really in-depth, ongoing, not just one moment in time, but ongoing support and feedback for teachers. That's problem number one. And problem number two is that they're not giving teachers the best possible high quality resources that we can possibly have for children. Because if we don't have ongoing support and we don't have feedback and we don't have resources, that's the tipping point for guided reading failure. And it's just not possible to do responsive guided reading that is both leading children into independence and strategic knowledge, which are critical features of guided reading. It's not possible to do that if we're not responsive to the needs of children, meaning that when we sit down at that table, what we do is determined by those children in front of us. Yes, we are using a book, but it's very important for us to understand that we are not teaching the book. We are teaching the readers who happen to be at that table.
Oh, yeah, no, that makes sense. So, we can expect many, many ideas and strategies from your seminar, but what are some big ideas that you could share that you hope teachers will take away from attending your session?
Well, there are actually 3 big ideas, but I want to start with an umbrella idea. And the umbrella is that the heart and soul of guided reading is really reading, writing, talking, and thinking our way across whatever books we happen to be using at the table. So 3 big things I want them to know: that number 1, responsive guided reading affords us instructional intensity. because guided reading is done in small groups where we very carefully choose children who have common, not the same, but they have some common needs. This means two things. Number one, it's impossible to form the perfect group where all of our children are exactly at the same place. And so to be responsive and thus to be intensive, which means to close that gap as quickly as we can, requires us to understand that we're meeting the needs of each of the children in that group. And to do that, we have to be sure that we are responsive to their needs so that we can flexibly change those groups. And what this means is that we're not going to keep doing the same group. And that's why it's impossible to just change groups with teachers. We have to make sure that those groups are changing and growing. So it's important for us to consider this responsiveness. The next one that I really want to focus on, and this is one that is often forgotten, is that guided reading is not the end goal. It's a means to an end. The end goal is that we are supporting children in becoming independent and strategic readers, which means that they can independently problem solve, not just at the table, but when they leave the table. And so we have to make sure that we guide this sense of becoming, if you will, an independent and strategic reader. In other words, we want to teach not the book, but the reader. I said that before, so that guided reading will become unnecessary. And I want to emphasize here that all children do not need guided reading in the same way or with the same frequency. And finally, the last thing that I want to emphasize is that there are three professional knowings that are what are the must-have knowledge that we bring to the guided reading table. Knowing number one is knowing the literacy research. It's not possible to do guided reading if we don't know the research specifically around guided reading. Knowing number two is knowing each and every child at that table, not knowing them based on data that is unrelated to the experience or based on what comes next in the basal, but based on who they are as readers across the learning day. And knowledge number three is knowledge of assessment. And that's where that knowing them across the day. Remember that the most important assessment that I want teachers to understand is the assessment that occurs in the context of guided reading and the observations that occur beyond it. These knowings are essential to guided reading to ensure the responsibility and the flexibility that will allow children to grow and thus allow our groups to grow and morph and change with them. Anything less is just a return to that static ability grouping that we were doing in 1972 when I became a teacher.
All right. Well, you've started off with providing some really great ideas and strategies that I think will be explored immensely in your course for guided reading. So thank you so much for kind of giving us a little sneak peek of what one can expect at your session.
You are most welcome, and I am very excited to meet teachers who come to the session. Thank you so much, Julianne.